Okay, well, let's start this way just so we're all on the same page as we go. And we're going to stay pretty much with the scripture and what the scripture says, as we always try to do, incidentally. There are some purposes of marriage, obviously. From the beginning, God intended companionship to be a primary goal. Uh, he saw that man was alone and that was not good. So he needed a companion. And so God created a good companion for him. He created male and female, the text says, and that is an important uh, thing too, because the creation of woman provided for some of the other purposes of God in multiplication of human beings on the earth and the purposes he had for man. So companionship's very important. Mutual help. She was to be a help suited to him. As it turns out, he is a help to her as well, wouldn't you say? So there's something mutual about this. We're going to understand from our life experience. They're to help each other. But her primary role is to be a companion and a help suited to him. The perpetuation of man is seen as a purpose for this creation of woman and for the marriage between male and female, man and woman, reproduction, multiply and replenish the earth is the way the text puts it. Multiply and replenish the earth. And then when we come over later explanations, particularly these two in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, purity of life, maintaining one's morality is one of the purposes of marriage. God provides within marriage the satisfaction of man's desires and his needs, and the woman's desires and her needs as well. Both have desires and have needs that are fulfilled within the marriage. So Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, because of immoralities, let every man have his wife, and let every woman have her husband. And that provides for avoiding fornication, immorality, sexual immorality in these periods of time. So these are very important issues, I think, as we go along. It's important, he says, in Hebrews 13, he says, the bed is undefiled, referring to the satisfaction of the physical needs in the marriage relationship. So all of that goes together as we look at it. Let me get that back. These are primary purposes and roles within the marriage relationship. and most other things that you might think about would fit into one of these categories, I think, as we go. Any question there? No, I think we all understand that. Now he says, let everyone have his own wife. And with regard to what Jesus introduces in the Sermon on the Mount, I think it is important to understand this principle as we go on. Just having a woman or a man, a husband or a wife, doesn't necessarily grant divine sanction of a marriage. There are other things that have to be considered, and that's where we're going this morning, pretty much. But it is possible to have a wife or a husband who is not your rightful spouse. It's possible to be married, and the Bible would use that word, married, or a husband or a wife, use those words to refer to a situation where one is illegitimate in the relationship. And that's what we need to remember. Herod, for example, John the Baptist lost his head telling Herod about his wife that he didn't have a right to her. She belonged to his brother in marriage, and that he had taken her from his brother. So, and the Samaritan woman, Jesus asked her about her husband, and she said she had had how many? 4 husbands, was it? I think. Huh? Jesus told her. But he said the one she had now was not her real husband from God's point of view, from the Lord's point of view. She was illegitimate, we might say, in that relationship. And so we've got a couple of really good, positive, immediate examples of how having a woman doesn't necessarily grant divine sanction to what is that relationship, you see, and vice versa with the husband and the wife. So we want to remember that, and that is what kind of leads into this idea of Jesus, that God is not pleased when one puts away his wife and marries somebody else, you see. Okay? I did think it might be good for us just to note, before we talk about the other passages, that there is an allowance for a temporary separation. Some take the position that you can divorce as long as you don't marry somebody else. And that doesn't really meet the intentions of God with regard to marriage. In 1 Corinthians 7, beginning at verse 5, why don't we read that? Just those 2 or 3 verses. You got them, Jeff? You're back there where you can talk loud and it'll go over everybody's ears. 5 to 7. Now I want you to read a little louder and read the right one. Okay. So what he says in this passage is, don't leave your mate, and be sure you fulfill the needs and desires of your mate within your marriage. That's the point of the passage. He says, now there might be times when you can't do that, or it's not appropriate or satisfactory to do that within the marriage. What might that be, for example? Give me an example. What might be a time in your marriage when you didn't fulfill the needs of your mate? Yeah, if you're sick, you might be sick, and it not be possible or appropriate for you to do that. You see. What else? Any other circumstances? Right, a job might take you somewhere, she says, and rightly so. Yeah. Yeah, you might just have emotions that don't seem appropriate in that situation for you, or you're just not able emotionally to handle it. You're mourning maybe over the loss of a parent or someone. Yeah.
There could even be just personal relationship issues in the marriage where, because of problems, tensions, or things like that going on that you're trying to work through, you're not necessarily in the mindset where that would be a good thing at the moment, or where it might not even be possible because of where your mindset is. So that's kind of what Paul's getting at here, is that there's God through Paul is telling us to allow for these kinds of situations.
Sure.
It's not supposed to be a permanent, I'm not doing this for you anymore, period. It's just a temporary thing.
That's right. That's what we're going to see in just a minute. So, it might be military service, takes you away, sends you to a foreign land for a while. What's the mate to do? Well, wait. And but now this, you see, he's going to say this is for a time. Doesn't he say that in the text? For a time. Now that says that's not permanent, does it? Divorce is not the option for you. It's an agreement, he's going to say. And he says it's for devotion and prayer. Doesn't he say that in the text? Give yourself to prayer while this. Prayer for what? Well, prayer for your mate, and maybe prayer for God's strength to overcome any temptations that are going on during that time, you see. So these are allowances, Paul says. I'm not commanding this. And then he says, so that you come together again. Notice that in the text? he says. So the purpose is so Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control, he says. So this is a good passage to help Christians, I think, deal with circumstances in life that come up, like you're saying here. All right, I thought it important maybe to put that into our discussion so that you would understand that the Bible is patient with these circumstances that we have. Okay, so Paul asks in 1 Corinthians 7, should married persons remain married? And the answer is yes, divorce is forbidden. He said, do not leave your mate. And Jesus said in Mark 10, what therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So this is the guideline for the marriage situation. In other words, divorce is not an option. God will give one allowance for divorce and remarriage in the text, but divorce is, when you're working through the situations, divorce is not an option to be considered. Okay? So the permanence of marriage, what God has joined together, let not man separate. That's stated by Matthew as well in Matthew 19. And in Romans 7 is one other passage you want to keep in mind. I'm trying to get before you the passages in the text. So when a question arises, you go to the text and see what it says. And Romans 7 says the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. If he's dead, she's free. So then, if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. You see. So we have Romans 7 and 1 Corinthians 7 as passages we want to keep in mind when we look directly at the things Jesus said, which is where we go next, of course. Our passage in Matthew 5 says, you've heard that it was said such and such, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, that's New King James, fornication, the old King James, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What do you think he means? He makes her commit adultery. Does she become an adulteress because he leaves necessarily? No, I don't think so. He is, yeah, go ahead.
I think the implication here is when he says whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The implication is that the woman who is divorced was not separated from her husband and her youth for the cause of fornication. There could be a situation where you scripturally divorce your spouse and you want to remarry, which Jesus gives the authority for here, and the person you choose to remarry, or the person you choose to marry, has authority to be married, that would be okay. But if you choose somebody who does not have God's authority to be married, then they become an adulterer or an adulteress by that means.
Okay. Her husband caused her to commit adultery by putting her away. and leaving her without his ordained means of fulfilling her needs and desires. And so she fulfills them by marrying someone else. You're responsible because you've put her away. And she doesn't commit adultery or fornication until she does that, until she actually does it. But you're responsible when she does. So what we have here is he puts her away and she marries another. What is that? Well, Jesus says, everyone who divorces his wife, except for fornication, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Okay? So both of these persons are going to commit adultery. Where's my deal here? She commits adultery and he commits adultery in this case. You see. All right, let's go ahead. Jesus in Matthew 19 talks about this. This is the longer passage. And what happens in verse 3, some Pharisees came to him, testing him, and saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? And he answered and said, have you not read? See, what Jesus does is he goes back to the book, doesn't he? So that's what we're trying to do. When a question comes up, and there are lots of questions, when a question comes up, we go to the book. What did God say? And what did Jesus say in this case? He answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're going to be united and become one. That's God's plan from the beginning. And that's what God ordained from the beginning, you see. All right? Consequently, Jesus says, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They become one, a unit of one. That doesn't mean the wife doesn't have her own mind, does it? Well, it better not. I mean, I won't refer to Linda in this situation, but and that's the way it should be. It's right. But they become united in this relationship and they become one. Jesus or Paul will talk about this in Ephesians chapter 5. And you might want to add that passage to your list of God's ordained will regarding marriage. Ephesians chapter 5, where he speaks of our becoming one with our mate. You are one body is the way he puts it in Ephesians chapter 5. And you don't separate a part of your body, you see. My wife, Paul says, is a part of me. You are one in this relationship. So just like I don't cut off my nose, I don't cut off my wife. That's probably not a real good illustration, but she becomes a part of who you are, is what Paul's point is. and you should consider yourselves one in that relationship. So they said to him, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. I want you to notice the difference between what they say, Moses commanded, and he said, God said Moses permitted. He didn't command. God never commanded you to leave your wife, but he permitted it. And why did he permit that under the law? Because of their hardness of heart. So we don't want to argue something that is motivated as being okay with the Lord, that is motivated by a hard heart. You see, we want to be careful about that. So, he restated the original ideal, God's intention from the beginning. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. What that also says is that God has done the joining in the marriage, ultimately. That he participates in the acceptance of the original marriage. And that's very important. He stated one exception that had not been previously stated from the beginning, and that is fornication, immorality. It's translated in some passages, unchastity in some other passages, all right? So Jesus says, to conclude that, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So that's very straightforward and very, very plain, isn't it? Let me turn around here with this. He puts her away. He marries another. What is that? Jesus says that's adultery. She is put away, but she marries another. What is that? He says that's adultery. Okay? So that is Matthew chapter 19. And he goes on to talk about some who can't handle. The disciples say, this is hard. This is a hard statement. And Jesus says, yeah, there's some that can't handle it. But it's God's will. Read the next few verses down in the text. Okay? Now, let's look at some parallel passages very quickly here. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. This is the one passage where he applies this directly to the woman as well as the man. You'll notice the male, masculine words are used in the other passages. So here we have just the clarification that this applies to both parties within the marriage. Yeah, George.
So obviously not to go down a rabbit hole too deep, right? And, if he remarries, right, isn't the implication that he's going to consummate that relationship and would thus make him a fornicator in that regard? And so the wife that was previously put away, would she now be free from that obligation to say, okay, well, you're now an adulterer, or you're now a fornicator, right? Now I'm released from this bond, or it's just really the ordering of the action, and it's somewhat semantic.
Well, is that what Jesus says is going to be our question? What he says is he puts her away. He puts her away. He marries her. What is that? All right, what is this?
Well, right. Well, what I'm saying is at that point, has he not fornicated with someone else? If he's remarrying this woman here, right?
Right.
Is he not consummating that relationship? And would that not be considered fornication?
It is considered fornication, adultery. He calls it adultery. But what does Jesus say about the other one?
Well, he says in which case the one who put away the other may remarry without adultery. So, I don't know. I guess.
Yeah.
So for her, right?
See, he says he put her away.
Yep. I got that.
And
then he remarries her. The guy in the life, he put her away, remarries her, right? And so he's a fornicator at this point, right? Because he sent his wife off, he married this other woman. He's a fornicator at this point. So what's Susie gonna do? The put away spouse, she was put away, and her husband committed adultery. So at that point, is she an adulteress? If her husband, who put her away, remarries another, which we've said is fornication and adultery. So she was put away, her husband committed, adultery. Is she now free to remarry someone else, or is she just done for all time? Obviously, not assuming he doesn't die.
yeah, all I know on that question, honestly, is what Jesus said. And he says, that's adultery, and that's adultery. Okay. Then when both of them commit adultery, both of them marry, each of them marries, that's adultery, is what Jesus says. Now, you would have to assume it, wouldn't you? Yeah. 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 You have to assume all that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. According to Jesus, well, what he has said is, he who puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery. And the one put away marries another commits adultery. Now that's what he said. And that's all he said. And if we go beyond that, then we're kind of out on our own. It is. It is. That's not what he says. Yes.
So, I mean, part of this is he doesn't make a flow chart for all of the different situations. There's just a few instances where it's discussed, and we have to kind of read it and then infer what the most natural reading is. Like the first verse that we were looking at earlier, the one earlier in Matthew 5, where it talks about anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim, or makes her become an adulteress. It forces her to become an adulteress. It doesn't say forces her to become an adulteress if he doesn't commit adultery himself. It's just if you put your wife away or for any reason other than adultery, you're making her be an adulteress. Period. Full stop. That's what it says. Now, our instinct is we don't want to see fairness. And so from our perspective, that might feel, well, this really isn't fair to the woman if the woman didn't commit adultery and she wants to still be married or whatever. And now she still wants to be taken care of and she wants a partner and all that. And now she's forced to commit adultery if she goes and seeks a partner. But the way the most natural reading just says, if she does that, she becomes an adulteress, regardless of what he does afterwards. And that can make it difficult. Now, also, the reason why you are not making your wife an adulteress if you divorce her for adultery is because she already is an adulteress if you're divorcing her for that reason. So, it's difficult for us, I think, at times because we want to see a nice flow chart. We want perfect fairness in all situations, and we also don't. Times are different now because, for example, in our current age, both parties can seek divorce. And so it adds some additional complications in there. But we have to just read the text as best we can, I think, and then use what we read and try to interpret out of the text and not force into the text what makes us feel good. And I know that can be difficult, but I think that's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go on. Luke records Jesus' statement on this. This is in Luke 16, verse 18. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. So that's what he says. In summary, let's put these 4 passages that we're operating from here in the beginning with the Sermon on the Mount. The man, he puts her away, he marries another, commits adultery. That's very clear, isn't it? The woman, she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So that's very clear. That's this. The divorced woman, the man who divorced her, makes her commit adultery and commits adultery against her when he divorces her, puts her away. The third party, whoever marries a divorced person, commits adultery. So now, if I'm a put away person and I marry another person, I've made them an adulteress or an adulterer, is what Jesus is saying, correct? They commit adultery with me in that situation. That's what Jesus says. Yes.
You know, that's kind of hard. That's hard to understand. An innocent person done nothing, and now it's an adultery because her mate has divorced her because he wants someone else. It's hard for me to. How does an innocent person become a sinner? I mean, you know, your wife divorces you.
The innocent person doesn't become a sinner until they commit adultery themselves in one of these ways.
Sounds like if he divorces her, then she becomes an adulterer.
She-
She's innocent. She hasn't done anything.
Yeah,
Go back to them other slides, and it sounds like both of them are adulterers. Even though the one that hasn't done anything, it sounds like she's an adulterer too.
well, she only is an adulterer when she commits adultery.
Well, that's not what the verse was saying we were looking at just a minute ago. It sounded like she was an adulterer, so she was put away. Whoever who marries her commits adultery too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, it's hard for me to, accept if a woman, her husband puts her away because he wants another woman. He hasn't done anything.
Yeah.
So I understand that if she marries someone else,
Yeah. I don't think any of us really would understand that passage to mean if she is an innocent person and has not committed adultery.
if she hasn't done anything and her husband's divorcing her because he wants someone else,
Yes.
She wouldn't be an adulterer just because she got divorced. It implies that she also sought intimacy and became intimate with or had married somebody else. It's not like just him marrying or going off. There's this, I mean, it doesn't explain, you do have to read, but I think there's an implied, well, this is assuming once she's put away, that she goes off with somebody else. And if she didn't do that, she would not be an adulteress. If she abstains from any intimacy or whatever, then she would remain innocent, for sure.
Does that only allow someone to divorce? Because that's what it sounds like here, is that you can get a divorce if your spouse has committed adultery, but you can't divorce. Is that what it means? That the only thing you can do is legally divorce and you settle divorce? Because they committed adultery.
You can put away a mate for adultery and marry another. Yes.
Because they, I think that's where the confusion's coming in, is that if a woman who is not committing adultery, if her husband divorces her, she doesn't agree to the divorce, obviously, she knows she can't be divorced, but he goes and has and remarries, well, now he is an adulterer. So at that point, can she recognize the divorce and say, or does she have to say, I will divorce you now, and then be free to remarry?
I'm not sure I'm the authority on that situation.
Well, a lot
Yeah.
of times, what people have done or talked about is, well, if this is the way it is, then I have to be the first one to the lawyer's office and make sure the papers are signed and dated beforehand for it to be working. And that's where the flow chart thing starts to come in.
That's kind of silly.
And that's very silly. I think we can get ourselves into trouble with that. I think what I've done preaching over the years is just like Polly has done, is listed all these scriptures, right? And let everybody look at that and apply it to their situation, right? And we preach it this way from the pulpit. But in the final analysis, who's going to stand before God on Judgment Day? Are we going up there as a committee? No. We stand individually before God based on the text that we have in front of us. And you need to be comfortable standing before God. That's what I say to people. Because when you talk to people, sometimes they say, well, no, you were the first one to do this, or no, you stepped out on me first, or, this. As a preacher or someone who's a third party in this, we don't know all of those details. We have to say the text. This is what is the text in the Word of God, and you need to apply it to your situation and be comfortable standing before God. Obviously, when details are coming out, leadership in the church deals with those things as they are revealed. But it is a complicated matter, and it's very emotional, and we want to be right. So we've got to put those things together in the right way.
Exactly. Very well stated. Yes. Okay. Yes, George.
Sorry, I love that Ray said that. Because like, yes, when you stand before God, you're not going to be able to say, well, Holly said I could do this, right?
Yeah, right.
It's not going to be that.
Don't you dare.
So thank you. It's true, right? It's a matter of your own personal, like how comfortable are you going to God and saying, all right, I did it this way, now judge me.
Uh-huh.
With the action that you took for anything.
Right. Right.
I love you said it. Thank you, Ray.
Okay. Well, at least we have before us what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And in these passages, we've tried to get all the passages. Please remember, you have 4 basic passages in the gospel narrative, and then you have Romans 7, 1 Corinthians 7, and Ephesians chapter 5 to use to develop your thinking. And as Ray has said, every individual is responsible to know God's word and to apply it to his situation, whatever that is. And sometimes that becomes difficult if it comes before the church, and then the elders have to work through it, I think, is what Ray was saying. Okay, we'll talk again.